Hey guys, in this module, let's talk about shipping your product. By now, you found your product, you found your factory, and it's time to ship it into Amazon's warehouses, which is a huge step. That's exciting, woo! There's a few different ways that you can ship your product, and let me break down the different options that you have. I think a lot of people who have never imported into the US get a little bit overwhelmed by this step, and you don't need to be, okay? So just bear with me here. You might hear a few different acronyms that you haven't heard before, and I'll explain all of this throughout this module. The first option that you have is essentially door-to-door shipping, and I like to call these air couriers. And these would be like UPS or FedEx. There's another popular one called TNT. These couriers pick up the goods from the factory, ship it to your house or straight into the Amazon distribution center. These are simple and straightforward. We'll talk about duties more in a second, and that's the only kind of concern when it comes to these. These are typically cheaper if they're organized by your supplier. For smaller and lighter shipments, the door-to-door shipments tend to work pretty well. As a rule of thumb, if it's under 200 kilograms, which is about 440 pounds, it's typically cheapest and easiest just to go with one of these air couriers that's arranged directly from your factory. If it's over 200 kilograms, these air courier shipments are going to get pretty expensive, in which case I recommend using a freight forwarder. And the freight forwarder is going to help you choose whether or not it's an air cargo shipment or a ocean shipment. So that these aren't confused, like the UPS and FedEx and DHL and TNT, I'll call those air couriers. And if you use air shipment with a freight forwarder, I'll call those air cargo. The process for shipping those is a little bit different, which we'll discuss in a second. All right, so under 200 pounds, air courier. Over 200 pounds, you're gonna use a freight forwarder. A freight forwarder you can think of as someone who helps you get your goods, like from the factory or from the port over in China or wherever they're being manufactured, into the US through customs and then to your house or to Amazon. There's a lot of steps through that process, and freight forwarders are professionals about handling these different steps. Also just know that some of the stuff that we talk about, it gets a little bit more complicated, but at the end of the day, don't really worry about it because your freight forwarder will handle all that for you. Over 200 kilograms, you're going with a freight forwarder. Now you have to decide whether or not you want ocean shipping or air shipping. As a quick overview, air shipping is going to be more expensive, or especially per kilogram, per cubic foot, it's going to be more expensive. Of course, it's going to be much quicker. So as a rough rule of thumb, you can usually get your goods in like 8 to 10 days, whereas an ocean shipment is going to take closer to a month, all right? For estimating the cost of air shipping, it's roughly $5 per kilogram. Now with ocean shipping, it's going to be significantly slower, but also significantly cheaper for larger and more heavier items. All right, so these are literally those huge cargo ships that you see with a million containers on them. That's what they would ship your goods in if you were to go this particular route. And the pricing for this is quite a bit different. The weight doesn't actually matter much. It's more so the amount of volume. As a rough rule of thumb, $450 per cubic meter of goods, but that changes a lot if you're just using like 1 cubic meter versus an entire container, because a lot of the fees associated with the ocean shipping are the inspections and customs and all that kind of stuff. You're probably asking like, okay, like what's better? Like it really depends on what your product is, how heavy or how large it is. And like I said, your freight forwarder can help you decide which one's best. Probably 90% of my shipments go ocean freight. It's more typical to go that route because of the cost savings. So if you do decide to go ocean shipment, you have to decide whether or not it's going to be a less than container load shipment or a full container load. And you'll see the acronyms LCL or FCL. Full container loads, there's 3 different sizes. There's 20 foot, there's 40 foot, and then there's 40 foot HQ. 40 foot is going to be most common. And typically what you do in these scenarios, if you are getting close to a full container load, is you talk to your factory about like, okay, how many units could you fit into a container? And oftentimes they'll tell you this too, like, hey, I'd like to order 500 units of this particular product. And, but it's like, hey, how many fit in a 20-foot container and how many fit in a 40-foot container? And they'll usually say like, okay, well, you tried to order 500. I can do 480 in a 20-foot container, so would you like to order that amount? Or alternatively, in a 40-foot, I could do 900, so would you like to increase it from 500 to 900? Because when you're doing a full container load, the shipping rate's going to be the same whether or not you fill up half of it or all of it. So as you can imagine, the per unit cost of shipping, if you fill up the whole container load, is going to be cheaper. Another really nice benefit about doing a full container load is you can actually do something called a floor loaded container. And this isn't talked about very often in the FBA communities, but it's actually a pretty sweet deal. What happens is with a less than container load, they're gonna ship your container into the US. It's going to go to your freight forwarder or a 3PL, which is a third-party logistics company. They're gonna unload your goods out of that container. There's other people's goods in there as well. They're gonna put it onto a pallet. They wrap the pallet up in saran wrap, and then a truck comes and picks it up and takes it into Amazon. During that process, it's more likely that your goods are going to get damaged because they have to take it out of a container and put it onto a pallet and then ship it in. It's going to take a little bit longer, and you're also going to have to pay for someone to do that, okay? Whereas a floor-loaded container, it actually never gets palletized. Instead, it gets shipped directly into Amazon's distribution centers. They just open up the container and they just unload all of it directly into Amazon. So this is gonna be the most cost-effective way to ship your goods, but you do need to do a full container load in order for to take advantage of this. Me personally, I do a lot of floor-loaded containers because it is the most economical, but of course you need to be shipping enough goods to kind of fill it up. Let's talk briefly about Incoterms. So you'll probably hear the terms EXW and FOB, those two acronyms. And let me show you a little bit more what that means. When I'm talking about Incoterms, it's essentially who is responsible for which part of the process, and essentially when do you hand over kind of responsibility for the goods? If the goods were to get damaged, who's responsible for them during that period? So by far the two most common are EXW or Ex Works and FOB, which is free on board. There's a whole bunch of Incoterms on this table, but I very, very rarely hear any of them except EXW, which is Ex Works, FOB, free on board, and then sometimes you'll hear DDP, which is delivery duty paid. Ex Works, essentially what happens is the factory is not responsible for any of the shipping obligations. So, you need to arrange for someone to pick up the goods from the factory and ship them to you. So this is gonna be the cheapest, and factories typically, when they give you pricing, will give you a per unit price or they'll give you a per unit price for either EXW, FOB, or both. The reason that FOB is gonna be more expensive is, as you can see, the factory is gonna be responsible for transporting the goods to the port, and then they put the goods onto the ship or hand it over at the port. And then after that, you're responsible for getting it into Amazon from there. I'd say FOB is typically the most common, shortly thereafter followed by Ex Works. And then DDP, the only time that I hear DDP is when you're referring to those air courier shipments, which are DHL and TNT and those guys. How this works is they bill you for the duties after it arrives at the warehouse. If you read online, you'll see some Amazon sellers say oh, well, if the goods are worth under $2,500, then you don't have to pay any duties. This is not technically correct, but oftentimes true. There is something called informal entry versus formal entry. How these two work is when you use a freight forwarder, the formal entry is going to be required and you always do it. With an informal entry, how that works is it's typically if you're using one of these big air couriers and essentially they're bringing all their goods in bulk, and you're kind of just covered under their customs bond. And what happens is the rule is supposed to be met for goods being used for personal consumption that are worth under $2,500. If they're commercial goods under $2,500, which yours would be, you're supposed to still pay duties on those. However, the vast majority of the time, customs just, I guess, turns a blind eye to it. So if your goods are valued at under $2,500 and you ship them through TNT or UPS or whatever, you typically don't have to pay any duties on them, but from time to time you will have to. So don't let that surprise you if you do. I get a lot of questions about how do you know how much you need to pay in duties? There is a calculator which we'll include a link to. This is the one I typically use, Freightos Import Duty Calculator. And how it works is, you select, all right, import into the US. This is typically from China. And then you have to enter your HS code. What an HS code is that is a universal or a worldwide code that describes the type of goods that you're importing. And based on that code, they're going to classify how it's going to be taxed. You can try to search for this. So we'll try to do like yard signs. It didn't give me anything, and that's common. It's kind of hard to correctly find the accurate HS code. The best way I've found is actually to go into the supplier database, find someone else who's been shipping that product. Let's see, metal yard sign, sure. And then take that HS code. Because if you start looking through their catalogs or use one of the HS search codes online, I don't know, it feels like it just takes me forever to actually find it. So this is what I typically do. Oops, now I have to go find this in there. So 9405 60. All right, and you choose which one from the list. Sure, for this example, that's cool. So it's estimated that this specific HS code does not have to pay duties. Some of them will be taxed, or you'll have to pay duties of 5 or 10 or maybe even 25%, depending on what kind of HS code it is. So this is how I figured that out. Like I said, if you do choose air courier and it's worth under $2,500, there's a good chance that you won't have to pay duties, even though technically that's not accurate and technically you really should be paying duties. They just, for whatever reason, turn a blind eye to it. Otherwise, you'll have to pay these duties when your goods arrive at port. I think it's technically within 10 days of them releasing the cargo, but oftentimes your freight forwarder will ask you to pay for it before it's kind of like released, all right? That's a big picture overview of how to ship your product. We're gonna be going into more details in different lessons, but like I said earlier, don't let all of this intimidate you. The one thing to take away from this, if it's under 200 kilograms, just use an air courier. It's probably gonna be pretty darn easy. Just book that through your factory. If it's under 2,500 bucks, you probably won't even have to pay duties, which is really nice, even though sometimes you will. If it's over 200 kilograms, just hire a freight forwarder. I'll recommend a couple in a later lesson. I typically recommend Freightos or Flexport. We'll go into those more in a separate lesson though. And they will essentially hold your hand and walk you through the entire process. Don't get overwhelmed about like, oh, I don't know how to do customs, or I don't know how to do this, or I'm not sure about that, because you can just ask your freight forwarder all these questions. And of course, everyone here at the Freedom Builder Bootcamp will be here to help you along the way as well. So that's it. In the next lesson, we'll talk a little bit about product inspections.